Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and we are going back to D-Day, which it seems to actually been quite a long time since we talked about D-Day, and it has been quite a long time since we've been talking about D-Day because we've been off the Eastern Front and the Pacific, but anyway, we're back to the subject that should be something I know about. But in this case, because of our guest's ability to burst my balloons over the last couple of years I've been following on Twitter, I'm going to kind of go into this prepared that half the stuff I think I know probably isn't true. Because if you know Stephen Fischer, he's an archaeologist, he's a historian, he does these deep dives, no pun intended for the subject we're talking about today, into some of these stories that have been repeated about the landings and naval history and World War II generally, and just kind of taking them back and picking them back and say, okay, where does this story come from and what can we learn about how the story has perhaps changed over the years? So you don't want to hear me rambling. I'm going to bring in Stephen Fischer. So good evening, Stephen. How are you today?
Good evening. I'm very well, thanks. I'm very chipper.
So this whole subject of obstacle clearance on D-Day is one of those ones that it doesn't get a huge amount of attention in your general books on D-Day. There's sort of little references to, and they cleared obstacles, like we had Nick standing, and they cleared mines. Then off it moves to people running up beaches with Bren guns and Sten guns and M1 rifles. But it is a subject that has got a little bit out of hand in terms of stories that have been repeated. So before we actually get into your presentation, why did you want to get to the bottom of this? What was the moment that you said, right, I need to go back and start this again and see what actually the truth is?
Well, actually, I'll mention that a bit later in the talk, because okay, there's a slide and I can show you the exact moment where I had this thought process and thought, well, hang on, what's that all about? And I mean, for me, the study of D-Day in particular is my main area of interest, and not just on the French side of the coast, but the English side as well. And one of the things that I found is, I mean, I have loads of books behind me. I don't read half of them, or I start them and I never quite finish them. But one of the things that I read more of is the primary source documents. Yeah. And I read far more of them than I do of the secondary histories. And one of the things that you start to realize is that a lot of the beliefs that we have about D-Day don't have an origin in those official histories, or in those official primary source documents that were filed, in some cases a few days after the events, and in other cases months perhaps. Now, of course, not all of the stories are told in those primary source documents, but when you go back into them, sometimes you will find stuff that completely contradicts what you think you know. And that is, for me, one of the most interesting bits about researching an area of history that is less than 80 years ago and is still relatively recent. And we can use, and most people who follow me on Twitter know that I'm also an archaeologist, and we can use archaeology as well as historical research to better understand these things. So yeah, for me it's just another angle of my fascination with history. But the fact that you come across these myths, it just becomes another rabbit hole to disappear.
Well, ultimately, we do have more tools at our disposal now. We have Google Earth, we have the documents online, we have, if we don't know someone in a site, we know someone else who does live there, and we can say, can you go down there and have a look at this thing and say, does it measure this much or this much? And we should be pooling all our resources on these things. But in the end, a lot of the books that we read kind of just sometimes regurgitate some of the things because someone else appears to have done the work. So they're established, they're well known. So then the new person builds on that research. But actually what you're doing is you're carrying on from a source that, as we're questioning, it may not have been quite precise in the beginning. Even things like operation names, like one of the things you talk about is Operation Dead Stick, the name for the landings, the gliders, and it seems to have been much later on in the story that became a term. So
yeah, and that seems to have come out from Stephen Ambrose basically, and there don't seem to be any references to it being Dead Stick before his book is published, and that's when it all starts. And of course, everyone, as you say, then just repeats something. It's a very minor detail, but it takes on a new meaning when you get to the stage when you suddenly realize that it's not necessarily accurate.
I mean, this is the thing. These kind of shows aren't going to change people's fundamental understanding of D-Day. The Allies still win. The Germans still lose. The 5 beaches still worked out roughly the way they did. It's just that getting attention to detail that we should be doing given what I just said about these sources we have now, we should be at the point, you say 80 years on, and say, okay, let's just go back and start again. So we could end up waffling on. So I'm going to pull up your PowerPoint onto screen because you've got loads of slides to get through. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Well, very quickly, I'll just say I disagree with you, Paul. I think this show does fundamentally change a lot of people's preconceptions about D-Day, and there's quite a wide community of people who are learning an awful lot from these, and it's a great platform. You've done a really good job. I've given since lockdown, and it's not just you; it's people like Brad and On This Day Canadian History. I've given lectures on stuff that I would never have necessarily given lectures on. In a physical environment. So I do think that shows like this are changing the way that many people think about the D-Day story. And other
it's changing things a little way that in the end makes perhaps a big difference. But but anyway, I'm going to hand over to you. So folks, I don't know that you'll need to kind of pose your questions. I have a feeling Stephen's going to cover everything as we go along. But as always, if you want to make comments, please fire away, and we'll do questions either at the end or as they come up. But basically, I'm going to hand over to Mr. Fischer and sit back and learn.
Well, there's some useful breaks. So this will be split into several sections as we go through the story. So there'll be a good opportunity, I suppose, at the end of each sort of section to chat about individual bits. So evening, everyone, and thank you for having me on, Paul. So tonight we're going to look at obstacle clearance on D-Day, and really that starts with the gent on the left of this picture, who I'm sure some of you will recognise, Erwin Rommel, and his arrival as Commander-in-Chief of the West Wall, or the Atlantic Wall. Now, the popular story is that it was his experience of using various obstacles, in particular tank traps and anti-tank devices and anti-tank obstacles in the Western Desert, that led him to sort of repeat that success on the Western defences. And prior to his arrival, it is true that the beaches weren't particularly heavily I don't want to say defended. There were plenty of defences. He did increase the number of those, but there were less in the way of actual anti-vehicle and anti-landing craft obstacles. Now, of course, he did also shore up the defences quite significantly, and the various Wiedelstrandel-nest and Strungpoint and so forth were enhanced and grew, and their number increased. I'm not going to talk about those because that's slightly of a side issue of what we're mainly interested in tonight, which is the obstacles themselves. So they were being very heavily developed. The obstacles kind of fall into two categories. There's the obstacles that are on the beaches to protect against the landing itself, and then there were other obstacles even further out to sea, and these of course were sea mines. And Rommel again pressed the Kriegsmarine to increase the number of sea mines that were available in the Bay of Seine and all along the Atlantic Wall, in fact. But I'm not going to talk about those either, because quite frankly, somebody's already done it. Nick Stanley did a very good talk last year. It was almost a year ago now, I think, Paul, clearing the lanes, looking at the...
Really? Wow.
Yeah, I think so. So go and look up for that one and Paul's channel, and you'll find an awful lot about minesweeping and the clearance of those obstacles. The main things we're going to talk about are those obstacles that are on the beach, there to basically imperil landing craft and vehicles trying to move up the beach. And some of them will be very familiar to the audience. In particular, this one, now my German is absolutely abysmal, so I'm about to massacre the pronunciation of these words, but I believe that's a Czechhinigel, which is literally Czech hedgehog.
Yeah.
This is probably the most famous of all sorts of anti-tank devices. Very simple, literally free steel beams welded and bolted together. But it was improved by the Germans, and we'll come to that in just a moment. The other type that was very prominent around Normandy is Tetrahedron. These examples I photographed behind Omaha Beach at the Big Red One Museum, Paul.
That's the Vieille-sur-Mer one, that is.
That's it, yeah. And these look to be authentic. They're certainly in very good condition, but they were probably hauled off the beach quite quickly after D-Day. The other type that is particularly simple and straightforward was the Minenthal. And literally there were thousands, hundreds upon thousands of these along the beaches, not all of them with mines by any means, just stakes pushed into the ground, and they're very resilient. They're a very good means of obstructing the passage of vehicles, at the very least slowing them down. And they came in various sorts of heights. Some of them were really only quite small. And you can see in this photo as well, the fact that it's also starting to subside. Now, lots of them were propped up with frames like this so that they did actually lean forward. So they were sort of facing into an approaching vessel or vehicle. Again, there's a mine on the top, which is going to make a bit of a mess of whatever might strike it. But the Germans did produce much taller versions of these. And these are called, oh crikey, Hoffähler, literally high stake, or something along those lines. And these, as you can see, are much bigger examples with a proper tripod style support. And these again are designed to face into a landing force and basically spike a landing craft if it was to come into contact with it.
And Stephen, is the height variation to do with the tide variation?
I don't know, to be honest, but I presume so, yes. But also its position on the beach and slightly different purposes. So the shorter ones appear to be more to deal with vehicles. The taller ones are more to deal with vessels. And so, yes, would be further out into the sea. The other type, which is probably most famous for being the wrong way around on Saving Private Ryan, is Hembolk. And these are ramps. Now, you'll notice they face the other way from the Hoffähler. The idea of these, and these are very much anti-vessel obstacles, is that a landing craft will ride up it as it is coming into the shore and crash over it. So it's basically going to disable a landing craft or prevent it from being able to beach and discharge its cargo. Now, these ones are quite interesting in that they're sort of multi-strand and they all connect to each other. So you've got a constant sort of sawtooth style arrangement of logs. So there's a continual line. But most of them, I mean, are far more separate. And you can see in this photograph, this quite famous photograph, which I tweeted earlier today. They're quite far apart. There's a good 50 meters between those obstacles there. But the effect is still the same because, you know, a landing craft is going to have to steer between them, and in a rough sea, it's going to struggle to do so. And then there's the much more famous, I think, maybe more famous, Element C, or that's the only name I can remember. Oh, Belgian Gate, that's it. Yeah. So called because they were used along the Belgian border. And these are very heavy metal gates, and they can literally just be dumped into the beach area and into the surf, and they are going to make a mess of any vessel that strikes them. And they are primarily anti-vessel in the manner in which they were deployed by the Germans, which was very separate most of the time. But they would also, if they were continuous, if they were all placed next to each other, they would create a very formidable barrier that would prevent vehicles from passing through as well. There were other types of obstacles, slightly less famous, slightly less numerous. So this is the Nussknacker, which literally means nutcracker. And this was an attempt by the Kriegsmarine, I believe, to try and create a very simple sea mine. And the idea is that these would be in the tidal area. And they work on a very simple system. You can see that there is a metal beam, and if that is struck, it will be pushed back. And then in the trough below it, you can see there's a shell, and it will literally just activate shell cap, blow it up, and you have a very improvised mine device. These weren't used in particularly great numbers in Normandy. They were being deployed around the coast, but there are only a few examples of them, largely spread around. So they're not a common one on the Normandy beaches. And another one that was definitely less common was the Schwimmend Bulken mine, which is floating piles or something like that. These were spotted off Gold Beach in photo reconnaissance only about a week before the invasion. And that was the only place that they'd been sighted. They are literally just a floating mine, so made very simply out of logs. And as you can see, a number of telemines arranged along its length. They were connected to concrete sinkers so that they wouldn't float away. In the event, that's exactly what happened. And we'll come to it in more detail later, but basically, they only found 2 of them off Gold Beach. They did find a number of concrete sinkers, which suggested that the Germans intended to arrange a continuous line of these off Gold Beach, which would have been quite dangerous to the landing craft coming in had that happened. But as it was, the Force 4 storm that played a bit of havoc with the landings anyway, had also broken all of these away, and most of them had floated off, so they didn't actually present any danger. And then there are the improvised ones, the type that you don't tend to see in any sort of report or catalogue. And you can see in this photograph, and I haven't been able to work out the location, I'm afraid, but as well as timber stakes, there are some very odd tetrahedrons arranged on stakes towards the bottom of those pictures. And this seems to be a very sort of informal arrangement. There doesn't seem to be any master plan behind these, and it's hard to work out what was hoping to be achieved by these. But anywhere along the beaches, you might find these sorts of improvised obstacles. Whether any of these were found in Normandy, I don't know, but there's every chance that there were improvised arrangements of the obstacles being used by the German army.
And just to interrupt, these ones like the floating one on gold and those one you just photoed, do we think that's more kind of the improvisation by local commanders rather than directives coming from a higher power? Because if it was something they wanted to put everywhere, you'd think you'd see more evidence for them around other places. So is that what your take on that?
The Nutcracker was certainly being used in other parts of the coast. Right. The Schwimmen Balkan mine, no, doesn't appear to have been utilised elsewhere. Not that I've been able to find anything about, at any rate. So it looks like they were starting to use them, but they look very improvised in design. And yeah, probably is a local arrangement rather.
Because you'd think the ideas would start from beach, because you'd look at it if you were there and you say, well, we've got trees behind here, they're big. What could we do with them? If you were in an area, I mean, I know some of the beaches up, for example, between Utah and Cherbourg, there's no trees for 3 or 4 miles. You wouldn't be kind of improvising something where you have to go and get materials, but if you're from miles away, but if you were right there and you're a commander and you're trying to impress someone, your boss, well, I might as well cut them up and put them on there. It makes sense to me.
Yeah, it certainly seems very feasible. And behind Gold Beach, you do have enough woods.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely.
Sort of that could have been achieved. You're quite right. The methods in which these obstacles were installed, again, tended to vary according to local resources and local supplies and abilities. And most of them, of course, being quite heavy and made of very heavy steel or concrete, could be towed into place by tractor units and that sort of thing. And here we see a very interesting carriage that's been used to lift the tetrahedron, and then that can be dragged to wherever it needs to be placed. Although when I was searching through the images for this, I did find this rather interesting picture, and I can't for the life of me work out what's gone wrong there, but I don't think he's supposed to be still depositing it when the tide is coming in. I can't really see how they're going to get him out of there without him getting quite wet. You saw the element C being towed into place by horses, and of course, the German army is, as we know, was not fully mechanized at this time, and that goes for all manner of the work they were doing. So horses were used quite frequently. With the stakes, it took too long to dig a hole that the stake could then be put into before the sand collapsed and had filled the hole. So they brought in pile drivers, which you can see in this photograph. But of course, the problem with those is that they take a very, very long time. And it was taking something like an hour per stake, I believe. But one of the improvised solutions that they did come up with, and Steve Zaloga, I think, is the person who researched this and found out more about it, was creating what was essentially quicksand and using fire brigade hose pipes to spray holes into the ground, and that liquefaction effect then meant you could drive the pole in very, very quickly. And I think they had it down to something like 3 minutes to erect one of these, which is a great example of local improvised solutions that were then spread around the wider area. So these could be installed in far greater quantities than pile driving allowed. So it looks very impressive when you start to see all of these obstacles lined up on the beach, and you can see this very, very, very dense collection of ramps and stakes just here. But photos can be deceptive, and if we zoom out of this photo, and that area of all of those stakes is up in the top right, it's actually more to do with the angle of the photograph. And this is one of the photos I tweeted earlier today, photographed by Lieutenant Albert Lanker at Alt, north of Dieppe. And you can see that actually in reality, these obstacles are very spread out. And this largely comes down to lack of resources and lack of materials. There's an awful lot of metal in these obstacles, and there's an awful lot of beach to try and fill. You can also see there the effect that the tide has had, because the tide is out in this photograph, and those Czech hedgehogs have sunk quite substantially into the sand, and that's the effect of, you know, the constant incoming and outgoing tides is just basically moving them and sinking them and making them somewhat less effective. And that is something that was noticed on D-Day. This photograph is from the 7th of June on Gold's Jig Beach. And you can see that one of these stakes is barely an impediment to anyone. I mean, you might trip over it, but it's not really going to bother anyone else. Even so, it's been mined for demolition, so it is going to be blown up shortly. But yeah, the quality of the obstacles had suffered through months and in some cases years of actually being on the foreshore. But of course, they weren't just there to be impediments to the vehicles, as I said, and these look very impressive. This is obviously going to stop an invading army, or at least slow it down as it approaches a beach. But the other aspect of it, of course, is that they're going to be an impediment to the landing craft and will try and prevent a landing in the first place. And whilst we often look at Czech hedgehogs and their ability to block roads and slow down the passage of tanks, what we tend to think of a bit less is the effect they'll have on a landing craft, because a landing craft being very shallow bottomed, designed to get into very shallow water, is going to rip its hull apart on those things. And that is what happened on D-Day a great deal. So they were very effective in two ways, both at low tide for preventing the access of vehicles and at high tide for preventing the access of vessels. And here we see some of the Hoffähler again with the tide in, and you can see that that is going to make access for anything bigger than a minor landing craft, anything bigger than a Higgins boat, is going to struggle to get through there without striking one of those obstacles. And this is something that happened on D-Day. That hundreds of landing craft were lost, well, not lost, but incapacitated as a result of the obstacles, and we'll come to that later. Now, on the individual beaches, you get different arrangements. There was no consistent pattern to the way in which these obstacles were arranged. They came in all different sort of arrangements, lines, and that sort of thing. So this is Omaha Beach. And again, we're used to seeing photos like this where you have this kind of jumble of obstacles that all seem sort of randomly placed. And that wasn't really the case. And if we look more closely at the arrangements, it's just out of sight behind the World War II TV star up in the top right. There's a little A, and that marks the tetrahedrons at the top of the photograph, out at the front of the beach. B, just below them, those are the Belgian Gates. And then C, you've got your ramp obstacles. And then D is the Czech hedgehogs, which usually tend to be in the shallower water because they serve that dual purpose. So the stakes and the ramps are usually in the deeper water to counter the landing craft. They're not an impediment to vehicles, but the Czech hedgehogs can be an impediment to both, so they're better off placed slightly further inland. This is Le Hamel, no, sorry, this is La Rivière at the east end of Gold King Beach. And you can see that actually there, the obstacles weren't that dense at all. This is just a few weeks before D-Day, and there's literally only a single line of Czech hedgehogs. But if we go further to the west, and this is around WN36, so there's Le Hamel is on the right, and you can just make out Asnelles in the background and the church spire on the right. And here on Gold Beach, we can see a far more dense array of obstacles. So we've got Belgian Gates in the foreground, ramp obstacles, tetrahedrons, and then Czech hedgehogs. And they are literally, that's a very dense collection.
So just comparing those two photos there, Stephen, is part of the reason why the Germans are putting a thicker line, you know, just basically half a mile or a mile away from a thinner line, is they're trying to kind of deter us from one area to funnel us into perhaps where they think they've got a better set of defenses or more bunkers, or there's a limited road network. It's because we can't think of the obstacles as the sole impediment. There's the whole defensive structure, there's the road network, there's, you know, all those other angles that they're thinking of. So they're thinking, well, let's put lots there to the left and there to the right, but we'll leave that middle bit with less. So they'll come in this way and hit and walk right into our 88s kind of thing.
I think from the bits I've looked at, and I can't claim to have studied all of the obstacles comprehensively, but it seems to be more a reaction to the existing defences. So here, in front of La Rivière, you have the sea wall. You've also got, and you can barely see it there, but the long building in the middle of the photograph, just to the right of that, is the strong point, WN33, is it, in La Riviere, the bunker?
33 or 32, yeah, 33, I think, yeah.
32, let's go with 32.
One of them, yeah.
Yeah, and you can just make out the faint mound on the sea wall, and that is the bunker that's still there today. So this is obviously already slightly better covered by having that sea wall, which is an obstacle in its own right. And then in other places, so around WN36, you've got open fields, you've got access roads with no natural obstacles. So there they seem to have gone a little bit denser. But then to shoot that theory in the foot, here at WN37 is immediately on the right of this photograph. And there's Asnell's in much clearer detail in the background. Again, there's hardly any obstacles. Although that said, in the foreground, and here at Gold, it was a big factor, you've got that clay, which made the vehicles and vehicles in particular bogged down very badly in that clay. So they might have seen that as the natural barrier and thus needed less obstacles. Not to say they wouldn't have added more if they had the materials and the time. I'm sure they would have. But yeah, there does seem to be arrangements based on the local terrain, but I don't think they ever really had the time to reinforce as much as they wanted to. So some of it would have just been on what they could get into place before the invasion happened. I'm sure if D-Day had been delayed by a few more months, then a lot of these obstacles would have been much thicker. So yeah, you get a real mix of obstacles. This is just up the coast from Utah. So it's not actually Utah Beach itself. I think it's just north of there. But again, you can see the dense arrangement of them. And of course, behind Utah, it's flat ground. So that's less of a natural obstacle. At Ouistreham, this is actually in front of Franceville Plage, looking over towards Sword Beach area, but the other side of the river. And again, you can see quite a dense collection of stakes, and in the foreground, the Czech Hedgehogs, and there's some ramps further out to sea. In front of Ouistreham itself, there's very little. But again, I suppose that the fact that Ouistreham is so well defended itself in having the gun batteries, the strong points there, that they only really felt they needed the Belgian Gates, because that is literally all that is there. And this is a week before D-Day. And this is a demonstration of mortar fire on a ranged target. But at Sword Beach itself, Queen Red and Queen White, the arrangement was a little bit more like this. So there are actually 2 rows of ramps in the deep water, and then 2 rows of stakes, and then a double row of tetrahedra and Czech hedgehogs inland from that. So Sword Beach looked a little bit like this, just double everything that you can see in that picture. And I mentioned Sword Beach in particular because I'm going to talk about Sword as an example as we carry on. And there's a blank slide for questions.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I've been trying to answer some for them as we come along there. I mean, my comment, having been out the last couple of days with Colin, walking on, well, we're not so much on the beaches, is that another aspect is that how difficult or how easy it is for the Germans to get to certain beaches, how long they have on the beach before the tide comes in, because there's certain bits where it comes in faster. So you would know on that beach, you've only got 3 or 4 hours in between, because I know the tides at the same time, but how far it comes up those little sort of funnels of water would make a difference. And, how passable is the road? Some of the areas down to Gold bit near WN35, the road down there is muddy. So, if you trucks going up there would be difficult to get to, perhaps if it was rainy, whereas if you're in Ouistreham and there's a road that goes right up there, it's easy to get things there. So I think all those variables are going to play a part up and down the coast. Just the ease of getting things done, and how long a section a German commander has to cover. Has he got 2 miles or 15 miles? I think there's lots of variables that would explain or help explain the density or lack of density.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
And I think
we had a question. Sorry to interrupt. Which beach had the most obstacles per kilometre? But I don't know how you would quite quantify
I can tell you that. I'll have to have a quick look at the document, but I shall do that later on, because that question has been answered, at least for the Commonwealth beaches. Right. So I can answer you that in a minute, but I'll need to look at the file. But don't worry, I know where it is. Okay, so that's what the Germans had done. Now, obviously, the British were aware of beach obstacles. They'd been deploying them on their own beaches in 1940. And so all of the preparation for the return to Europe had incorporated the fact that there would need to be some form of defense of, some form of offense to overcome these obstacles. So if we go back to the slides, sorry, so this is 1943, and they're testing the ability of vehicles to traverse their own defences. So anyone who's studied defences in the UK, like Chris Kolonko or myself, will recognise this as the Scaffold Defense. And it proved remarkably unresilient to a charging Churchill tank, which went pretty much straight through it. It did slow down, but that was the worst of it. And once that had been broken, it was, of course, passable to other vehicles. But as well as ramming, they also experimented with blowing stuff up. So this is a carrot charge that had been placed on the same type of obstacle. The tank has reversed to a safe distance, and you can see the tank just on the right of that massive explosion. And that explosion gets bigger in the film footage, as you might imagine. And it did, it made quite a mess of the obstacle. Although, of course, something like scaffolding is not going to be completely destroyed because it's not a solid structure. So the blast goes between the scaffold poles quite significantly. So the British and then the Americans, when they arrived, were already looking at beach obstacles. But in towards the end of 1943 and then into 1944, as the invasion gets closer, they realize they need more information and more detail. And there were a number of reconnaissance missions to Normandy in particular. And I won't go into all of them, but if you do want to find out more about beach reconnaissance and missions that were carried out in advance of D-Day, because there were very surreptitious little missions to inspect the beaches, to recover soil samples and that sort of thing, then go to COP Survey, Rob Crane's website, which has got tremendous detail on some of them, and he's doing fantastic work on. And
he's watching as well.
Is he?
So,
oh,
yeah.
He's done tremendous work on finding out more about these missions, and again, finding out new stories about them, and sometimes squashing small myths that have grown up around them. So these reconnaissance missions were very useful. Not all of them are interested in beach obstacles, but I will mention one in particular, and that's Hardtack 21 on the 26th of December 1943. And this was led by 10 Commando, one troop of 10 Commando, which is the French commandos, and is led by this gentleman on the right, Lieutenant Francis Vush. I think that's how you pronounce it. And it was just up the coast from Utah Beach. So Utah is that red line at the bottom, and their landing was at Quinneville, I think.
Quinneville, yeah.
Not in front of the town itself, but just a little bit outside of it. And one of their missions was to investigate this new defense that had been popping up recently, in which the Allies knew remarkably little about. And this is the Belgian Gate, or Element C. And it's a bit of a surprise that they knew so little about it, given that it was a Belgian defence. And that opportunity was missed to record them when they were on the same continent, and you had to wait 3 years before they could go back and find out what they were all about. But his recording of it, and they took all of the necessary measurements, meant that the Allies could then better understand them and prepare methods in which to deal with them. As well as the reconnaissance missions, the actual landings, of course, you also have aerial photo reconnaissance, and this is ongoing, of course, throughout the war from very early on, but it especially heats up in the run-up to D-Day. And these absolutely amazing photographs taken by Lieutenant Albert Lanker of the 31st Photo Reconnaissance Squadron. This is the 6th of May 1944, and as I said in my tweet earlier today, this is up the coast from Dieppe at the French town of Alt. And you can see he's captured these beach obstacles in amazing detail there. The beach reconnaissance really isn't necessary, really, given what he's managed to photograph, and they could learn an awful lot from these photos.
I feel he's getting sea spray in his cockpit, that guy.
Yeah,
he's really low.
There must be a rooster tail of spray behind his lightning, I'd have thought, to capture these images. And here you can see Belgian gates erected, and the method by which the poles are being driven into the ground. So that looks like a pile driver there rather than the hose type. And so photo reconnaissance really was a way in which the Allies could learn more about the individual obstacles that were going to face them. So this is Utah Beach, and this is, again, very shortly before D-Day. So the Allies knew exactly what to expect when they came into land. And as you get very close to D-Day, they were slightly alarmed by well, an event that is recounted in The Green Beret by Hilary St. George Saunders in 1949 that came out. And in there it's claimed that a Bomber Command bomber was attacking the battery at Hulgate, which I've circled. It's to the east of Ouistreham, when a bomb fell short and detonated several mines, well, they're presumed to be mines. There were a number of chain explosions on the beach in front of Hulgate. So I've looked into this, and I cannot find any record of a Bomber Command mission to Hulgate in April or May 1944. So I need to find more primary source information on that. There is, of course, the very real possibility it was an American bomber, but I question if it was at Hulgate, because I cannot find any references to bombing raids there until 2 weeks before D-Day. So the chances of it being in April seems somewhat slimmer. And it can't have been from the bombing mission 2 weeks before D-Day, because this event, if indeed it happened, sets off a number of very last-minute reconnaissance missions called Operation Tarbrush. And Operation Tarbrush was essentially... Oh, sorry, I'm fast-forwarding. The point was that this has supposedly alerted the Allies to the fact that these beach obstacles may be mined. So as well as being big metal or concrete obstacles, there might be explosives on them as well, which wasn't anticipated. Now, I question if that's really the case, but it is worth observing that this intelligence document from the 21st of April 1944 shows all of the major beach obstacles, but none of them have any explosives on them. So it is quite possible that the Allies weren't actually anticipating explosive-tipped obstacles. So this sets in chain a number of last-minute raids or recon missions called Operation Tarbrush, and there were 4 of these, all far away from Normandy. Small units, pairs of men taken across the coast, and basically with the mission to try and bring back a mine. And they were broadly successful in that 2 of the operations succeeded. The one up near Dunkirk could never land, and then Operation Tarbrush 10, that bottom one, the 2 men involved, Captains Lane and Captain Woodadge, were both captured, and they could easily have been shot as saboteurs, but they were in fact taken in front of Rommel, who didn't shoot them, which was very sporting of him. So they both survived the war. But whatever the origin of the missions, certainly by the time you get to D-Day, there is far better intel, and you can see mines have been added to those Czech Hedgehogs in this intelligence document. And basically, with the combination of the aerial reconnaissance photos and all of these missions across the channel to look more closely at these obstacles, there was a far better understanding of exactly what the Allies were up against. And, you know, along with Operation Hardtack 21, the exact dimensions of the Belgian Gate were recognised, and so the Allies have a clearer idea of what to expect and, crucially, how to tackle it.
And just to interrupt you, we've talked about the sources that we're going. I think only more recently, people like yourself have we realised how many times we updated those reports. We've known for decades that they had these reports that went across Eisenhower's desks and others. You know, here's the type of obstacles. But the fact it's not that they do it once and that's it. That becomes a document. It's a document that has amendments and changes as they refine and add information. As it comes in from the aerial reconnaissance, oh, this type now seems to be more prevalent here. We've noticed it. We've determined a measurement. The average measurement is now this compared to what we used to think it was this. So it's a progressively developing set of intelligence.
It is, absolutely, and quite right. And here's a good example of that. So this is an annex to the orders for D-Day. This is an overlay to be placed on a map. You can see the grid positions are perfectly placed there. And this is to amend the earlier documents. So this is a substitution, and the old substitutions have to be thrown away, and this is the new intelligence to be based on. And this overlay is from the D-Day story collection and shows the updated appreciation of the obstacles that will be found on Sword Beach on the landing area of Queen Red and Queen White. So using all of this information, the Allies were able to work out the best way to deal with these obstacles. And in the main, the belief was that explosives were the best way. So here you've got a Czech Hedgehog. There's a mine up at the top end of it. And those men have stood far too cheerfully too close to it, I would say. But they've also wired it for demolitions. There's a plastic explosive charge there and a fuse, and they will blow that up from the center. That will detonate the mine as well, and the obstacle will be destroyed. So that's the main expectation. They also started creating these combined operations pamphlets, for which there was a combined operations pamphlet for every conceivable sort of operation, like cliff assaults and organizing landing tables and that sort of thing. And this pamphlet, which was put into production in February 1944, gave the guidance on exactly how underwater obstacles were to be dealt with, including who's dealing with what, the necessary dimensions for clearing a lane for a landing craft or for a vehicle, that sort of thing, the weights of these things, that kind of thing. So there's a wealth of guidance open to the Allies by the time you get into the spring of 1944. And using all of this and the training that they've undertaken and the practicing, they started to evolve the best strategy, or the sort of tactics, I suppose, to deal with these obstacles that are crowding the beaches. And now I apologize for these awful little charts that I've produced. I went for some rather garish colors so they'll be as visible as possible. So this is a very, very rough approximation of Sword Beach. And you have the
I recognized it immediately, Steve.
There's a double row of ramps immediately in front of the landing craft. And then you have the double row of stakes, and then the double row of Czech Hedgehogs and Tetrahedron. And the idea, of course, is that the Allies are going to land at low tide, so all of these are exposed. Now, there are essentially 3 units involved in the demolition of the obstacles on the Commonwealth beaches. And the first of those, oh, sorry, no, that was a lie. There's a 4th unit. The very first thing that's going to happen before any units have landed is that these adjusted experimental landing craft assault, which are called the landing craft assault Hedgehog, are going to fire these spigot mortars at the beach defences. And the idea of these is solely, they're not anti-personnel, they're not anti-bunker. These were designed to clear an initial passage through the obstacles and aid the movement up the beach of the Hobart's funnies, the AVREs. So that was their sole mission. They're designed to get in close and blast a passage through. They weren't used on all beaches. They don't seem to have been used at Sword Beach at all. Then your AVREs land, and their mission is to drive a very straight, simple lane straight up through the obstacles. And they're going to achieve this using the multitude of vehicles at their disposal. This is an early 1944 photo. Forget the Sherman in the foreground, because that's just a regular Sherman. Somebody will correct me on that in just a moment, but in the purposes of this, it's a regular Sherman. Behind that, you've got the AVREs, the Churchill tanks that have been modified to carry fascines and bridges. There's a Sherman flail on the left. And all of these vehicles, as well as having their own particular missions, like putting the fascine in a tank trap, or putting the bridge up the sea wall, or flailing a path through the minefield, they've trained using these to demolish obstacles in their path. And you can see this AVRE literally just mowing down one of the stakes there. And in the film, which you can watch on the Imperial War Museum website, and the catalogue numbers down there in the bottom right, it just drives straight over it and clears that initial lane. The less entertaining bit for the crews is the person who then has to get out and mark the path that they have cleared up the beaches, which in this training exercise is done remarkably slowly and casually. But their mission is just to mark either side of this very simple and single file lane up the beach. So those first landing craft at beach, they're carrying those vital vehicles. And as I said, they've got far more to do than obstacle clearance, but they play that first role. Immediately behind them on the landing craft, and what sometimes gets slightly less attention, are the armoured bulldozers. Now, they're not part of the same unit. They're not part of Hobart's Funnies. These are just regular Royal Engineers attached to the Royal Engineer Field Companies. And they will work with the Royal Engineer infantry, for want of a better word, the men who are on the beach rather than in vehicles, in clearing the obstacles once they come ashore. And the bulldozers, I think, they don't really get enough merit for what they were able to achieve, because they were very powerful little vehicles. And you can see one here actually towing 3 Belgian gates, and they're acting like anchors in that sand. They're really dragging through. So to be able to pull them off is quite a feat. So they were very successful little vehicles, and yeah, their immediate role is to start assisting the Royal Engineer ground troops in clearing the beach. So after the Hobart's Funnies have landed, the assault infantry land, and they come in 2 waves, and then you've essentially got a 20-minute gap between Hobart's Funnies and then the next units that are tasked with obstacle clearance, and they're landing in landing craft assault, which you can see arrayed along the bottom of the screen. And their task is to start clearing those obstacles, and they work their way up the lanes that were cleared by the armoured vehicle Royal Engineers, and their task is to widen them. And as they do that, they're working on foot, probably not quite as casually as in this photograph, which is taken on the 7th of June, but they are using explosives to detonate these obstacles and widen those lanes. And as I said, they've got all of this training experience and the results of experiments that have been based on the findings made in those reconnaissance missions. So in this photograph, you can see plastic explosive charge wrapped around all of the vulnerable points of this Belgian gate. And this is where Allied planners and engineers had decided is the best place to try and blow up a Belgian gate. Hit these key joints and it will collapse into something that's far easier to drive over or to remove from the beach. At the same time, the Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers, they've got other stuff to do, but in each squadron, so on each beach, Queen Red Beach and Queen White Beach, 6 of the AVRE are tasked to turn around, having dropped their fascines or their bridge, and go back and help the Royal Engineers, because those Churchill tanks are equally adept at towing obstacles out of the way or driving them down and basically helping to clear that lane. Now, of course, while all of this is happening, the tide is coming in and pushing the Royal Engineers and the vehicles higher up the beach. But 2 of those landing craft assault that brought them all in are actually landing craft assault obstacle clearance, and they are carrying the landing craft obstacle clearance units. Now, the numbers in each unit vary a little bit. So in some there's 15, in some there's 11. The average per unit is about 12 men, 1 or 2 officers and 10 ratings. Some of them are Royal Marines, some of them are Royal Navy. And here, this is some of the units from 7 or 8 LCOCU. Sorry, landing craft obstacle clearance units 7 or 8, I think, at Sword Beach, and this is during Exercise Fabius, and they're at Gosport. And you can see, for a start, of the dozen men that are in that landing craft, only 5 of them are in diving suits. They were not all frogmen by any stretch of the imagination, because of course you need men on the landing craft to assist them, to help lower them into the water or pull them back out over the ramp, and not all of their work is designed to be done underwater. The landing craft can advance up to an obstacle, and then the men can place charges on it and then reverse away in the landing craft before detonating it, and so forth. So we need to be careful of this image of an entire landing craft full of frogmen all throwing themselves into the water to carry out their mission. The other thing that's worth noting is they didn't have fins. You know, most people associate frogmen with having fins, and they didn't. They were just wearing these wetsuits and some breathing apparatus. They weren't trying to swim very hard. They were going directly up to the obstacles, climbing down them and laying charges just beneath the surface.
I think this is where, I know you're going to get to this later, where the internet has got sort of UDT teams with these teams with Italian teams all kind of mixed up, and images have got shared. that aren't really appropriate to the subject they're discussing, and these various myths have kind of been created. But I want to just ask I want you to confirm the time. People have been checking which time these things were happening with regards to H hour, so we can address that one. And then my question is, obviously this clearing of paths up through the obstacles must have to connect, or should logically connect, with the other groups of engineers who are tasked with clearing beach exits over the seawall as well, because there's no point you clearing a path up that gets you to a dead end of seawall. So how are they coordinated? Because with engineers from these different types of units who have different roles, but they must be working together, otherwise it's not going to work seamlessly.
Well, the idea was that the landing craft that brought the AVREs would land perfectly opposite the pre-designated exits. And so they would then flail a path straight through the obstacles, right up to the exit, and then straight off. And then all the following landing craft will come into those exits, and they'll advance straight up the beach.
In reality, surely their first job, I'll let you talk, I shouldn't have interrupted you then, is to kind of check where the fuck they are first. Because if you start working and it turns out you're 500 yards from where you're supposed to be, or in this case, even 200 yards would make a huge difference if you're not in line with that intended exit.
Yes, and it did on the day. So yeah, we'll come to that. That is one of the.
And sorry, just if you could just confirm where these things are happening with regards H hour.
So this is the landing craft obstacle clearance units arrive about 20 minutes after H hour. So the AVREs are the first to land; they're dead on H hour,
right?
Or they are meant to be. And then the Royal Engineer units, it differs on the beaches. So Gold Beach, the infantry Royal Engineers, the actual just men on the ground, they're actually in the back of the landing craft tank, and they run off the landing craft after the AVREs have disembarked. At Sword Beach, they come 20 minutes later in landing craft assault. At Juno Beach, I think it's much the same as Sword Beach. So it differs a little bit because, of course, all three beaches, they all have their own formats that they've developed through training of how they're going to land. It's not a uniform strategy across all three of the Commonwealth beaches. So yeah, this image we have of the divers working underwater and blowing stuff up is a little bit unrealistic, because it isn't what was intended to happen, and it's very far removed from what actually did happen. And at Sword Beach, landing craft obstacle clearance units number 7 and 8, they had very specific tasks, and that was to buoy or buoy, if you're an American, the edges of the clear zone in the water, so they can basically mark up the channels that lead to the clear channels on the beach, that then leads to the beach exits. Within that zone, they have to remove all of the obstructions, and then mark any obstructions that they're not able to remove, and that includes sunken vessels. So they had a very specific remit for what they were supposed to achieve. And of course, they're doing this in the water, and on land, it is still the Royal Engineer units that are clearing above the high water mark. So as the tide advances up the beach, the Royal Engineers are moving up the beach as well and tackling the next set of obstacles. And behind them, the landing craft obstacle clearance units are sort of mopping up what they haven't been able to get. But there was, of course, a fail-safe for this, which is contained in the Force S orders, in the policy for beach and underwater obstacles clearance. If the obstacles are still there, and there is no other alternative, major landing craft proceeding at full speed avoid obstacles if practicable, if not, bust through. And this policy of bust through was very much ingrained in the Force S orders, because they were under instruction to land the army at all costs. And if that meant damaging the landing craft, so be it. The policy was get to the shore. And the orders are very clear on that. So keep bust through in your head, because there was a lot of it. And there's a brilliant piece of film footage, which unfortunately, I'm afraid I don't have the reference number for. I found it in a talk that I gave many, many years ago, and I didn't put the reference number in it, and I can't for the life of me find it now, but I've got this very, very short clip of this landing craft tank Mark III busting through these Belgian gates as the tide starts to immerse them. And it can be done, but the landing craft is not going to be going anywhere for a while, but you can at least get the troops onto the ground. Now, the American beaches, they were a bit different. I found this photo of naval combat demolition units in training. And they were very differently organized. So they didn't use the AVREs for a start. They used the DD swimming tanks, but they didn't use any equivalent of armored vehicle Royal Engineers, although they did have tank dozers. So Sherman tanks with a dozer unit on the front, and they did have bulldozers. But of course, their strategy on Omaha and Utah Beach was entirely different to the British. They were going to land masses of infantry and less armour in the first sort of 90 minutes of the landings. And rather than these obstacle clearance teams, they had what were called assault gap teams. And they had two elements. They had an Army Engineer unit, which was about a platoon of men, and they had a Naval Combat Demolition unit, which was about 14, 15 men. And they would work in tandem. The Naval Combat Demolition unit working on the water basic, the immersed obstacles, and the Army Engineer unit working above the tide line. And there were 16 of these assault gap teams on Omaha Beach, and then behind them, following about half an hour later, there's another additional 16 support teams that are going to come in and assist them after the first wave has passed through. Utah, same sort of policy in that they didn't use armoured vehicles. They called their units beach obstacle demolition parties. Their plan was more to use explosives to try and demolish these lines. So there's going to be, just before the landings, some bombing missions were going to detonate paths up the beaches and clear lanes that the beach obstacle demolition parties could then exploit and build upon. And so they had 8 of these teams to try and create 8 gaps, which would then be followed by 8 support teams. And they would start landing at about H plus 15, so 15 minutes after the first wave of infantry have landed. So that was the plan. And obviously what came to pass was a little bit different. But I imagine there might be some questions.
Yeah, so folks, if you've got any more questions about the actual kind of preparation, planning, anticipation, and if not, we'll move straight into the actual experience there. I mean, my comment would be is that the American and British and Commonwealth stories they're connected and they're moving kind of in sync, but there's also separate experiences, because the Americans are bringing some of their US Marine experience from the Pacific Theater, because they have done, I suppose, more beach landings than the Commonwealth have done by this point in the war. So it's a separate subject, and it would be worth tackling in its own right on another. I know you're touching on it to some level here, but it's not exactly the same.
No, they're quite different, and they used radically different approaches for the entirety of the assault. So that's going to happen with the obstacle clearance as well. Okay, so let's
no questions are coming, and I think they're just loving. They're waiting for you, really. They're loving what you're doing. So let's get into it.
Okay, so Sword Beach being the sort of example I gave. So this is a absolutely incredible photo taken at H hour by Lambton Byrne and published in his book Down Ramps in 1947, I think. I'll have to check that. But this is a brilliant photo because this actually captures H hour, and you can see the swimming DD tanks on the left and in the center, and intermixed with them the landing craft assault of the first South Lancs battalion, and just on the right you can make out one of the LCTs carrying the AVREs, and the schedule went a little bit to pop. They were all supposed to land a good 5 minutes apart, but they all ended up coming into the beach together. But what's interesting here is you can see just at the waterline, top left, the first row of obstacles, and the problem here is that the water is already lapping up against them. So those ramps are due to be immersed very, very quickly. And indeed, by 10 past 8, so this is 45 minutes after H hour, and this is the first wave of landing craft tank to subsequently land on the beaches after the AVREs. And you can see that the stakes are already immersed, and so are the tetrahedrons at the back of the beach. So all 3 rows of obstacles are now underwater. And by the time you get to Lovett's Commandos at just over an hour after H hour, all of the obstacles are immersed. The beach is very, very narrow, and these landing craft infantry are having to pass over all 3 rows of obstacles just to be able to land their men, because they can't stop behind the obstacles, or sorry, in front of them, because the infantry won't be able to get ashore. They will drown because the water is that deep. So what happened at Sword Beach, basically it didn't go to plan. 7 and 8 landing craft obstacle clearance units were unable to dive. The weather was too rough for them to be able to actually swim. And because the tide had come in so fast, there was literally no time for the Royal Engineer units of 629 Field Company Royal Engineers to carry out any demolitions on the beaches. So they managed to blow up a handful, half a dozen obstacles. And the rest was left to the landing craft to deal with. And they did most of the demolition themselves by just driving through them. And of the wave that this landing craft tank, this is LCT 610, looking straight towards Strongpoint Cod WN18. Their reports are replete with examples of the 13 landing craft tank involved driving slap bang into obstacles to detonate the mine so that they can basically get past it, rather than try and weave their way between them, because there wasn't the space available to do so. They realized that the best solution is just to drive into them and try and ride over it. And in many cases, the explosion, of course, demolishes the obstacle and only damages the ramp of the vessel, which they barely need by the time they get to the beach anyway, and the tanks can just drive off. So, and Sword Beach is not uncharacteristic of the other beaches either. And at Juno, you have much the same situation. The landings there were delayed significantly anyway. So HR was pushed back by about 15 minutes, a few days before the landing. And then on the day, when the naval commanders are there looking at the shore, they knocked it back another 10 minutes. So most of the landings start at 8 o'clock. And this is so that an offshore reef is suitably covered by water so that the landing craft can approach the beach. But the follow-on effect of that is that most of the obstacles are immersed as well. And the tale for the 4 landing craft obstacle clearance units there is much the same as Sword Beach. And they were unable to carry out any underwater demolition. Number 5 unit under Lieutenant Brewster commented that he was completely satisfied that diving was impossible in the conditions of the sea surf, because you've got a strong force 4 coming in from the northwest, which just makes it incredibly dangerous to try and swim, especially when you've got literally hundreds of landing craft bearing down on you, trying to force a way through. So there's just no space to be able to maneuver, and the sea is just too rough to be able to swim. And again, as with Sword Beach, the tide was already in by the time the infantry had landed, so the Royal Engineers and the Royal Canadian Engineers were unable to carry out much obstacle clearance at all. And then in one instance, and this bears mention, you'll notice at the bottom of this report, number 11 unit is missing. So this is number 11 landing craft obstacle clearance unit. And I wasn't sure what had happened to them at first. And then I subsequently found this later report made by one of the Force J commanders. At the bottom, you'll see it says there, landing craft obstacle clearance unit number 11 showed lack of determination and failed to achieve any results. And there's nothing else to explain this in any of the Force J reports or any documentation I've come over, including the landing craft obstacle clearance unit sort of wash-up meetings and that sort of thing. The answer is actually contained in the oral archive of Sergeant Briggs, Royal Marines, who was number 12. Number 12 landing craft obstacle clearance unit. And he says that the lieutenant in charge of number 11 got to the obstacles, decided it was too rough, and then they turned around and went back to their parent ship, and they were back at HMS, I forget the name of the HMS, it was the Isle of Wight, by the end of D-Day. So they didn't do anything, and they didn't achieve anything, and they were recommended to, that unit was broken up immediately afterwards, because they failed to show any, as the report says, a lack of determination. And that's all the official report says. There's no other reference to it. Gold Beach is very similar in many ways, but here the obstacles caused even more damage. And this is quite a very famous photo of LCT 886, which was one of the landing craft of 28th Flotilla D Squadron carrying the AVREs. onto Gold Jig Beach. And this was the flotilla commander's landing craft and the squadron commanders of the AVREs. And it was the one landing closest to WN-37 at the west end of the beach. And it was badly shot up by that 77mm Polish anti-tank gun. And it drifted because its engines were knocked out. And then it touched off several beach obstacles, which caused even more damage to it. And it eventually washed up in front of WN-36, completely out of action. And it's photographed here the next day. On the 7th of June. And if you look very closely at that Czech Hedgehog on the left, you can see that there is still a shell attached to it. Now, the reason for that is WN-37 played merry hell with the landings on Jig Beach, Jig Green, which was the primary landing area for Force G1 and the 231st Infantry Brigade. And the fact it hadn't been knocked out during the pre-bombardment or by any bombing missions meant that the anti-tank gun did lots of damage to the AVREs, Hobart's Funnies, and the landing craft. And it wasn't knocked out until late morning, the gun itself, but even then the strong points, ancillary weapons, the machine guns, and 5-centimeter guns continued to fire on the beach. And as the tide had come in very quickly, the landing craft obstacle clearance units and the Royal Engineers were constantly under fire from WN-37, so they couldn't carry out any clearance because they were literally pinned down behind the obstacles. Tide comes in, the obstacles are immersed, WN-37 is still pouring fire down the beach. And so the Beachmaster, the naval officer in charge, Commander Dolphin, says, right, that's it. And he closes Jig Green Beach, which is phenomenal. You know, that's a huge decision to make. And all of the landings are then shifted further east towards King on Jig Red Beach, which wasn't initially going to be used. Jig Red Beach was just the space in between King and Jig Green. And the reason it wasn't going to be used is because it's not ideal, because it basically faces onto that sort of swampy land and there's no beach exits. So all of the vehicles still have to trundle towards WN-36, which is still under fire, to get off the beach. So that really delayed the landings on Jig Green. And obstacle clearance couldn't be carried out until 4 p.m. And even then, the tide and the seas were quite rough, and they'd only cleared a fraction of the obstacles by the end of the day on D-Day. And so Jig Green wasn't really opened until the next day. And even then, when 7074, LCT 7074, which most people know I've worked on, and is now down outside the D-Day story in Portsmouth. When that comes into land, those beach obstacles are still there. And there's there's LCT 886 on the left of the photo, and you can see the number of obstacles between 7074 and 886, all of them with a shell still on them, waiting to detonate. So it was an incredibly dangerous landing, even for 7074. Full 24 hours after D-Day. And so King Beach is much the same. The tide has come in much faster. The fire that's coming from WN-33, which we looked at earlier, hinders the immediate attempts to clear the beach before the tide comes in. So again, the tide comes in faster than the defences can be subdued, and it's not until much later in the afternoon that clearance of the beach begins to happen. Even so, they did manage to clear most of King Beach by the end of D-Day. But in the main, it's once the tide has gone out and it's Royal Engineers going back out to the now dry obstacles and placing explosives on them and detonating them. And I think this photo is from the 7th of June as well. And it's a case really of doing it once the initial landings have happened. And in contrast to the obstacle clearance unit that went back to the Isle of Wight on D-Day, the obstacle clearance units on Gold Beach were there for 3 or 4 days clearing obstacles because they were needed to finish off that work. Now, the American beaches are a little bit different and quite well captured photographically, because, of course, Robert Capa took this photograph of what was for many years considered to be men sheltering from machine gun fire, until somebody pointed out that the insignia on the helmets indicates that these are the beach clearance units. And they were a bit more successful at this exact point where Robert Capa himself landed. And this is Gap Team number 10 which was in one of the sheltered bits of beach, one that was under slightly less heavy fire. And they were able to clear 2 exits up the beach, a 50-yard wide one and a 100-yard wide beach lanes up the shore. But elsewhere, of course, the landings faltered and the engineers were caught in that as well. It is said, although I haven't done any primary source research on the Naval Combat Demolition Units, it is said that Gap Team 14 may have been the very first unit to land on Omaha Beach at 6:25, because apparently Lieutenant Wood, the commander of Gap Team 14, misbelieved the landing time. He thought H hour was 6:20 instead of 6:30, and so he insisted his coxswain get them ashore for 6:25. But either way, their landing craft mechanized was then blown up by a mortar bomb, and most of the men were killed. By the time they got off the landing craft, the assault infantry had come in as well. So, like I said, I need to do more research on that in primary sources to see if that is a tale that has evolved or is actually based on official reports. So most of the Gap teams, they suffered quite severe casualties, and more than half of them were late getting onto the beaches anyway, up to 15 minutes late. The buoys or buoys that they were using to mark the channels out to sea, they were sunk very quickly under the weight of fire, and they suffered very heavy casualties. And as with the other beaches, most of the obstacle clearance takes place after the assault units have moved through and after the beaches have been cleared of enemy fire. Even so, they did tremendous work, and there's no doubting the heroism that they displayed under fire, and that's borne out by the awards that were given to the gapping teams at Omaha. And there's 15 Distinguished Service Crosses or something like that, 7 Navy Crosses, and a Presidential Unit Citation for Naval Combat Demolition Units. Utah Beach was very different, probably the most successful obstacle clearance event of D-Day, if you like. Their 8 gapping teams, apparently there was a bit of a mix-up in loading them onto the boats, and so the gapping teams and their support teams all landed at the same time, which obviously puts twice as many men on the beach immediately rather than staggered. But as everyone knows, the landings at Utah were in the wrong place, which turned out to be a bit of a blessing in disguise. There were less obstacles there was less enemy fire, and some reports state that Utah Beach was clear of obstacles by 9:30, which is 3 hours after the landings, which is absolutely phenomenal. So that was brilliant work. There are some stories that some of the combat demolition units, or sorry, beach gapping teams as they called them there, they landed on the correct beach, which of course became the wrong beach, and they actually had to get involved in firefights with some of the strong points there before they then moved down the beach and joined their comrades. But that would appear to be a individual case if it did actually happen. So yeah, Utah was definitely much more successful than the other beaches, but yes, the others were very much hamstrung by the sea and by enemy fire, which of course you can expect. And no plan survives contact with the enemy, as the old saying goes, and it was inevitable that nothing would happen exactly as was planned or as had happened in rehearsals and exercises. And you know, D-Day, all of D-Day is like that. No unit carried out all of its tasks in exactly the fashion that they had written down or they'd done in their exercise Fabius. It's inevitable that conditions on the day are going to change what happens, and these units responded and they worked with the situation as it occurred. So they couldn't dive, so they didn't dive. So instead, the landing craft obstacle clearance units take to the shore and they assist the Royal Engineers in clearing the obstacles as soon as is practically possible. But that happens after the landings because it is just too difficult with the high tide, and it is too busy with the assault waves landing to blow up obstacles. You can't start detonating obstacles as infantry are literally swarming past them. So the obstacle clearance had to be delayed until after the assaults had gone through and the beaches were cleared of the enemy. I'm sure there's got to be questions now.
There was one that I will bring up that you may be coming up to later on from Charlie. Rather surprised you said the LCOCU divers didn't use fins when they are seen training with them in the Pathé News film.
Pathé News film that dates to 1945.
There we are. That was simply done. Yes.
And looking through the documents that I have and the film of them on Exercise Fabius, there are no fins to be seen. And they do not appear to have been intending to use them. Or if they did, it was a last-minute decision, or they kept it well hidden. So yeah, I take Charlie's point, and I was surprised when I realised this as well. But they don't appear to have had them.
And the other thing is, there's been lots of conversations about the tide and anticipate, why the tide came in faster. Then we take too long to go through all the comments of that. But I mean, one of the things I can always say from living here is that you never catch Sword Beach at low tide because it just doesn't last long. If you're trying to get to a tour and show people Omaha Beach at low tide, you've got several hours to play with. But if you miss the low tide on Sword Beach by more than sort of 20 minutes, it's come in. It always, you seem to always end up having about the same amount of beach, whether it's high tide or low tide. It just doesn't hang around there. And that's that kind of local understanding that, again, when we go back to how the German commanders would have installed obviously they'd have known those sorts of things because they'd have been experiencing on a day-to-day basis. But we're coming back to when we talk about these reports that are established, created of obstacles and time. If you're a lowly, lieutenant in a unit, you're not getting all of this information that could be coming your way. Because if you were given every bit of information about tides, every information about weather, you'd be bombarded with just too much stuff to take on board. So just because we're talking about information available, it's not always available to everybody who might possibly need it. Is that fair to say?
I think so, yeah. And with the tide coming in, I mean, there are multiple reasons. I mean, very briefly, tide prediction at the time was not an exact science. And to be fair, it still isn't now. There are still things that will affect the incoming and outgoing tide, like air pressure, which you cannot account for when you're doing your moon tables. And back then, of course, the fully understanding the tides was nowhere near as precise as our moon tables today. And of course, the weather driving the surf in much, much quicker, this north westerly winds pushing the sea higher up the beach. It just changed everyone's expectation of what was going to happen. So the side effect is that the overall effect is that you just can't follow the plan as was laid out.
And we're gonna get what you're gonna deal with next is basically this question is how does Stephen rate the overall effectiveness of the obstacle plan? That's what you're going to be doing now, I'm guessing.
That is literally
the next thing there. But just French battlefield guide, who I'm assuming is someone I know. So for both Canadian beaches, it was AVRI, RE first, then LCOCU behind.
No, not quite. So as I said, it varied on each beach. So for Sword, for instance, it was the AVRE with the Royal Engineer Armoured Bulldozers first, then the Assault Infantry, then the reserve companies of infantry with the Royal Engineers and the Landing Craft Obstacle Clearance Units. At Gold Beach, it was the AVRE and the Royal Engineer Bulldozers and the Royal Engineer Infantry all at the same time, with the Landing Craft Obstacle Clearance Units immediately behind them.
Right.
And as it happened, the Landing Craft Obstacle Clearance Units actually went slightly higher up the beach on Gold, and the men disgorged before the tanks could. So the Landing Craft Obstacle Clearance Units were technically the very first units to land on Gold Beach by seconds.
Right.
So it differed according to the plans, but broadly speaking, you've got those three units, the AVREs, the Royal Engineers, the Landing Craft Obstacle Clearance Units, all landing within a very short period of time in the opening waves. But
it's not quite simultaneously, but it kind of nearly is. But let's move in now to the analysis of it, because I think that's what we're waiting for. And then the myths and legends, and then we're still enjoying it. So,
well, to be honest, it's not really so much what I think about how it transpires.
Well, indeed, it's what was said at the time.
More what the people involved thought. And so there was a sort of wash-up meeting down at Appledore at the end of June, where the various landing craft obstacle clearance units all gathered together, and they met with several senior officers and Professor Bernal, who had carried out a survey on Gold Beach and Juno Beach on the 7th of June to discuss the success of the operation. And the language is all very it's very straight, like, you know,
It's
all,
shrouded with the technical, the language those things are full of, diplomatic, very,
yes,
the
it's very,
textbook of how to write up these reports for management.
yeah, exactly that. So you'll see bullet point 1. It was proposed by Commander Whitford and Professor Bernal that the landing craft clearance units, though asked to do more than was originally envisaged, carried out these tasks most creditably under the severe weather conditions which prevailed in the operation, which is effectively saying they did the very best they could under very trying circumstances, which is a very fair point. One of the immediate sort of realizations was that they would need more of these landing craft obstacle clearance units. And bullet point 3 says that if you're going to do this again and you want complete clearance, you need far more men and personnel and equipment. Some of the recommendations that came from individual units was, let's not use landing craft assault. They're terrible. Let's use ducks instead. And they would be a far better platform, especially for carrying the weight of explosives that would be needed and that sort of thing. Bullet point number 4, the best, safest and surest method of clearing the obstacles is by mechanical rather than by explosive means.
Now that's a big one, isn't it? That's a big statement. Yeah.
And when you look back on the plan for D-Day, which is to blow as much stuff up as possible, and you think, well, hang on, they're supposed to do this whilst the assault infantry are still landing. Yeah, there's a landing every 5 minutes on Surest Beach, essentially, or, you know, well, there's up to 15 minutes between waves, but it takes that long for everyone to get off of the vessels. There's no clear spell in which you can then start detonating plastic explosives and blowing huge chunks of metal shrapnel all across the area. And you look back at it and you think, well, why on earth did they think that was a good idea? And, you know, that's just something that had to be tried to be realized. So that's fair. So the D7 armored bulldozers were seen as being the best vehicles for this. The tanks effective, but they've got other things to do. The armored bulldozers are purpose designed for this task, so they're definitely the best. And then, yeah, number 5, as I said, the method of blowing with explosive charges was also used, but this involved either risk or delay to the passage of troops and vehicles. Then number 6, the key element for what I'll come to a bit later, which is the myth that surrounds what happened on D-Day. The diving method was not used owing to weather conditions. And it's bluntly stated there by the landing craft obstacle clearance units themselves. And they did not swim because it was not safe. And that is completely understandable. Given what we know of D-Day, look at the beaches, the photographs, the sheer number of vessels coming in and ramming these obstacles. They're not going to see a diver. They're not going to see even the landing craft assault that they're operating from is too small fry to be in the way of a landing craft tank that's got to land its tanks. It's just going to drive through it. So that was the primary findings of the wash-up. And yeah, the explosive method is insanely dangerous, really. And Professor Bernal noted this himself on the 7th of June and said, you know, asking men to place explosive charges on some of these obstacles without blowing themselves up is not particularly easy. And Professor Bernal was one person who went onto the beaches on the 7th of June, and there was another survey carried out. Sorry, this is another of his photographs of the Belgian Gates and the impact of the damage that had been caused to them by vessels ramming them. Another survey was undertaken by Colonel G.C. Reeves. He wandered around on Gold Beach on the 7th of June, photographing various obstacles, amongst other things. And here he noted what would appear to be waterproofed shells, which was something that the Allies hadn't really anticipated, but a means of at least preventing these shells from detonating or, you know, rotting away prematurely. And so the sort of conclusions that were reached are rather bluntly spelled out. And this is Admiral Ramsay's report. So this is the final report on the naval aspect of Neptune. And he dodged the issue of whether the obstacle clearance had been successful by saying, well, I'll leave it to the committee that I've just referred to. But he said that the the obstacles were the greatest enemy on D-Day. It wasn't the strong points, it wasn't the anti-tank guns, it was the obstacles. And when you look at the casualties that they caused, the following table gives the casualty figure to craft in the assault and is considered that about 50% of those can be attributed to beach obstacles in combination with telemines attached to the obstacles. So Sword Beach, 18 LCT, so 9 of those will be obstacles. 29 LCA, so 15 of those are going to be obstacles, and all told the total figures 131 LCT, and these are very preliminary figures. I'm actually going through these and seeing how accurate they are, because this report came out shortly after D-Day and it's based on reports that were filed only days after D-Day. There's probably some margin of error in these figures, but 131 LCT damaged or casualty vessels, and half of those, so a good 60 to 70 of those, are going to be a result of obstacles. And this is why features back in the UK, like the landing craft repair slips that had been built in 1943 and 1944, were so valuable, because that meant that these landing craft could be turned around again very quickly. They could be dragged out of the water, the bottoms repaired, because those are the bits that suffer the most damage, and they could be back in action in less than a week, a couple of days in some instances. But yes, the obstacles were the greatest enemy to the landing forces. And partially that is a result because they hadn't been cleared. But we know why that is. It's because they couldn't be cleared. And that's nobody's fault. It's just the culmination of all of those factors, the weather and the enemy action, and the tide delaying the ability to clear.
But it's suggesting that although the obstacle clearing didn't work to the complete success, it worked to some success. If it hadn't been there at all, this figure would only have been higher, which then potentially puts the landings in some kind of jeopardy. And the whole idea of 50% of these LCTs being hit on obstacles, because the conventional wisdom is it's the German, it's the 88s, it's the guns, it's the devastating firepower. That's your kind of Call of Duty Saving Private Ryan idea of destruction of craft coming in. And 50%, it's a staggering number. It's we're putting a lot of focus on these obstacles. I think me as a Normandy guy, Roman, Colin, watching it, I think we dismiss them a little bit as kind of not essential to the German plan. It's more about the actual the gunnery.
Yeah, and I think most people do, and I certainly did until I started reading this stuff, and then you suddenly realise the true story of the obstacles, which I'll come to in a minute, is one that is very different to the one that you'll find online. So one of the conclusions that was observed in Ramsey's report is that there needs to be more experimentation in ways to get rid of these obstacles. The clearance of obstacles in shallow water was impracticable during the assault due to the rate at which the landing craft beached and as the tide rose, and that would be a problem in future assaults as well. More training, more cooperation. One of the problems that was inherent in that combined operations pamphlet I showed you was that the Royal Engineers are supposed to work above the tide, landing craft obstacle clearance units are supposed to work below the tide. They are both operating under different command structures, and they are both separate to the Army beach parties that are landing and signposting exits and organising all of the logistics of the beach. And one of the findings was that all of these units should be umbrellaed under the beach units and working more cooperatively rather than under separate command structures, which is a very obvious thing. It's hard to disagree with that. And then yes, the American beaches. Why have I put this slide here?
I don't know, Stephen.
This is a summary of the American landings, and this is their sort of main findings. And they felt very much as the British did that more training was necessary. Opposition that was encountered meant that was what really hindered the landings and the clearance of obstacles, and that's of course not something that you can necessarily account for. That's just something that you have to deal with. And the work was carried out as best as possible, and that Utah was at least carried out very fast and very successfully. So the key findings really from D-Day are that it's hard to disagree with the conclusion, even though it's not written down, was that it didn't really work as intended. Now, as you say, it did work, because at the end of the day, D-Day worked, and for D-Day to work, every individual element needs to have had some level of success. It just didn't work as the plan was laid out, and in order to to critically analyze D-Day, you have to take in not just the work of the landing craft obstacle clearance, the entire obstacle clearance. You have to take D-Day as a whole. You have to look at the success of the infantry in clearing the beach defences. You have to look at the success of the AVREs in clearing the lanes. The assault infantry going inland and attacking the defences inland, and the mortar positions and the gun batteries that are shelling the beaches. All of these things have to be considered. So you can't just take obstacle clearance individually and say,
if we aim for 100% success with everything, aerial bombing, naval bombardment, obstacle clearance, engineer, gaps teams, infantry achieving their objectives, fighter cover, all of those things, and they all have 100% attempt to get to that, but they all reach 50 to 60, you add it all together, D-Day is a success, isn't it? Because the Germans are also trying to reach their 100%. They're trying to have all their defenses work to 100% efficiency, and they're only going to reach a percentage as well. So providing they reach a lesser percentage than the Allies reach collectively on sheer mathematics, the Allies win. But the other point I want to make is the fact is, I'm sure there are people watching this wondering, given that Operation Overlord was to get us into Western Europe and we're now there, why would there be the need to analyze how to do this again? Because we're not going to need to do it again. But I assume it's just in case things get bogged down and we decide we need to land in the Netherlands or Belgium or further up in the French coast in a kind of a Salerno-Anzio kind of way. I suppose that's the rationale.
Yeah, and that's the case. I mean, D-Day was never intended to be the last amphibious operation of the war. And for the Americans, they took a lot of these lessons and applied them in the Pacific. And they would have been extensively utilized if there'd been an invasion of Japan. I see Nick Stanley's just asked a question, were they employed in Walcheren landings? And no, the landing craft obstacle clearance units weren't, as far as I know, but they did, of course, have obstacle clearance teams who were going to work on the beaches. And I think they did take some of these lessons in that they would clear obstacles after the immediate landings. And then, of course, you've still got amphibious operations in the Mediterranean, so Operation Dragoon and that sort of thing. So there's one of the important and very good things about the Royal Navy is all of the reports that I've read, all of the official documents, they always contain pages upon pages of lessons learned and recommendations right up to the end of the war. And the Royal Navy are very good at learning from their missions, whether successful or unsuccessful. So it's just a standard part of their feedback.
And essentially, there's all those people who had been working on the planning who aren't going to be taken out of their offices to go and do something. Just because D-Day, they're not going to suddenly pick up a rifle and join on as a replacement of the Winnipeg rifles. They might as well continue in their offices doing the same analysis they've been doing before. But
that's their job.
Yeah, they're anticipating it
they won't
before. Now they're analyzing it as an event that's happened. So carry on the work, carry on adding to the files. It closes all those cases. They can say, here's what we expected to find. Here's what happened. Here's our report. Case closed. File. What's the next job? Exactly. But now we're coming to the juicy bit, which is kind of the myth and legend and how all the these things have established, and then we can open up to questions again. So the myths and what you said a couple of times, you dropped those hints of there's misinformation out there. So I guess is where it's going to get kind of cool now. So back to you.
It's sort of indicative of the fact that to have this talk, I really have to have this section in it, because I'm sure there might even be people watching now or who watch it later who are thinking, oh, well, when's he going to talk about the night landings? And D-Day is fertile ground for these sorts of stories. And you and I have both seen them, Paul. And was it Brad not long ago posted about some Special Forces unit that landed behind Juno Beach 2 days before D-Day.
Oh God, they come up every few months. Up comes one of these stories about. Did you hear about the paratroopers who dropped behind there, or the special teams, the SAS? These things just keep on servicing, don't they?
Yeah, and that's it. D-Day is fertile ground, and you know, in the haze of warfare, it's possible for these stories to creep in, and I think that's very much what's happened. And you know, you asked how I first came to realise this and why I became interested in this, Paul. And if we go back to the slides, the moment it sort of dawned on me was when I was looking at this document, and this is the Force S reports for D-Day. And this is group 5, sorry, and this is the reserve companies of the assault battalions landing 20 minutes after H hour. And I was glancing over it, and I'd looked at it several times before, and this is years ago now, I can't remember exactly when. But then at the bottom, I noticed these 2 landing craft and LCOCU. I just sort of thought, why is that there? Because I heard these stories that the landing craft obstacle clearance units had landed several hours before H hour and had cleared the obstacles, and I'd never really thought any more of it. It just wasn't an aspect of D-Day I'd ever researched or looked at, and you know, I'd never thought any more of it. I just sort of took that at face value, and it's only when you start to learn these things and study them in more detail that you start to then discover these contradictory documents, and you think, oh, well, what's that all about? So I started searching for more information about this, and then I started looking at why this story had come about. And that's something I've been doing off and on for the last year, actually, is trying to trace the evolution of this story. And I think I've got it now. And it starts in July 1944, so a month after D-Day. And this article in the War Illustrated, entitled "With the Suicide Squads Who Cleared the Way." Now, the first half of the article is actually about the reconnaissance missions, so it's of more interest to Cop Survey and Rob Crane. But there's this giveaway line that I've marked out in red in the title bit. And sorry, it's a bit small, but basically it says, the first cracks in the breach were made by Royal Navy men and Marines and Royal Engineers shortly before 0 hour. On June the 6th, 1944. So there you have it, your first implication that these units have landed before H hour, in advance of the D-Day landings. And you know, if we're going to time D-Day to the actual landing, 0 hour is H hour. That's when the first men step off the landing craft. There's loads of stuff happening before that, and we'll come to that. But to say shortly before 0 hour is to imply that this is an advance operation. So that's 1944, July 1944. The following year, 1945, the landing craft obstacle clearance units, with fins this time, make the front page of the War Illustrated. And down at the bottom in the caption, it's commented that their heroic story will be told for a long time to come, or something along those lines. And then also in 1945, you have this, the British Pathé film that lifts the lid on this secretive operation and has that crucial sentence: the Frogmen were on the beaches before the main assault began. And I think you've put the link to this in.
Yeah, the link to this film is in the description below, folks. So if you want to watch
it's only 2 minutes long.
Yeah,
and you know, it's not totally inaccurate, but it's got that line in it. And then this is followed only a few years later, 1950, by the book The Frogmen, which, you know, to this day remains the sort of definitive retelling of underwater operations throughout the Second World War, not just D-Day, but you know, all things, the chariots and that sort of thing. And then it has this sentence in it: the first men ashore on D-Day were Frogmen. This time they were called Landing Craft Obstruction Clearance Units. There were 120 of them, and their object was to clear away the underwater obstructions and mines so that the assault craft could get on the beach. And that's how it seems to have started. It's just these little lines. There's no definitive detail. There's no set number of hours. There's no clarity as to the exact nature of their operations. It's just that it was before everyone else. And then that grows, as you might expect, and it doesn't take long for it to enter popular magazines. And I've got a copy of this from the 1990s. This is my copy, so I haven't got I haven't been able to work out when To Strike Unseen was first published. It doesn't say in here, but that's the earliest edition cover of it. And these main characters have all sorts of fun on chariots and blowing stuff up, and then they become frogmen on D-Day, and again they land substantially in advance of the assault units and clear away hundreds of obstacles. And so by the time you get to the 1990s and the internet, really you've got quite fertile ground for this retelling to just retell itself. And it's always been the case, mainly, and I've seen it in magazines, on websites, and quite reputable organizations, just this line that they landed in advance of the D-Day, landed in advance of the assault units. The usual line is first ashore on D-Day, something along those lines. And as time has progressed, since the first retelling in July 1944, in the last 75, 76, 77 years, that has evolved. And the other thing that unfortunately has caused it to evolve more than anything else, in my opinion, is the other sort of big thing of the 90s, which is oral archiving of veterans. Now, there's multiple things to discuss here. First, there's the problems that are inherent in eyewitness testimony, and what people actually record of an event as it is happening, and how much they actually remember, and what they remember the right things. Now, I don't think that veterans would have misremembered stuff as it happened on the day, but I do think that by the time these recordings are being made in the 1990s, after 50 years passage of time, which is longer than I've been alive, I think it is perfectly feasible that their memories will have misled them. Now,
especially if the question gets put to you in a way, I know you might come up to this in a minute, but if you're someone who's interviewing a veteran and you have read these comics and you've read that book and you've got an idea that the first people ashore are divers, and you put it to a regular South Lancs guy on Sword Beach, for example, and you say, of course, the divers came in ahead of you. Did you see any of them? No, I didn't see any of them. They must have been ahead of me. He's kind of confirmed what the interviewer said, but he's not really, he wouldn't have necessarily brought it up himself, but he's now appeared to corroborate a story, but it isn't something he would have brought up of his own volition, maybe.
And there's some very interesting articles about eyewitness testimony and memory, and some of the best ones that came out were in the wake of the tragic death of Charles de Mendes, the Brazilian who was killed after the 7/7 bombings, and what people perceived they had seen, which is him running through the train station when, subsequently all the film footage proved that he'd walked quite casually, and people remembered different things, and some of it was based on what they'd then been told by other people. And that's passage of days. When you add into that the passage of 50 years, the changes are quite fascinating. And Sergeant Briggs, Royal Marines, who I mentioned had done an oral archive, his oral archive is very good, but he does make this odd claim that whilst he was on the beach, he was leant up against the seawall and he could hear the Germans on the other side on parade, which doesn't make any sense at all, because he knows that there'd been a huge barrage and the assault infantry are attacking. They wouldn't be on parade. So he makes a minor error. He's acquired a memory from somewhere else, and I'd love to know if there's a film somewhere that I haven't seen that somehow has something about the frogmen or something like that that has created this misleading impression in some people's memories. But otherwise, his account is very good and very factual and very knowledgeable. There is one other account which was on the Imperial War Museum archive and was recorded in 1999, which they've now taken down after I contacted them. And it was fair to say it was basically a flight of fantasy. And this man claims to have landed on the beaches several hours in advance of Haychapper in a inflatable dinghy, which he had moored under the pier in front of Arromanches. And you and I both know, Paul, there's never been a pier at Arromanches. It would never survive, for one thing. He had shot the machine gun crew of a German pillbox with a waterproof Remington rifle, which saved a whole landing craft crew of infantry and that sort of thing. And then, because of the delays on Omaha Beach, he was jetted off to Omaha to help clear the obstacles there as well. Now, it's a full 15 miles from Gold Beach to Omaha Beach as the crow flies. And when you bear in mind that the landing craft has to go out to sea, to the lowering position, to follow a swept channel across to Omaha Beach, which probably hasn't been cleared yet, it's going to take you at least 3 hours.
And going against the flow of traffic, which is going up and down to the beach.
Yeah, and against the tide.
Highly
and by
unlikely.
the time he could have got there, by any means that existed at the time, the Rangers were off the beach. That Omaha was clear by then, and there is no way, given the closure of Gold Beach, that the naval officers in charge of the sanctioned the removal of their own landing craft obstacle clearance units to help at another beach.
Yeah, you literally showed us photos of them still doing it on the 7th. So
they had quite
wouldn't have let a guy go. Yeah.
So, and unfortunately, his account has been very well published and received quite a bit of coverage, and that I think has helped grow the story. Which has meant, I think, in the last 20 years since it was recorded, that the story of landing craft obstacle clearance units being first on the beach has become more embellished. And now it's reached the stage where there's 3 elements to the story. 1, they were the only unit involved in obstacle clearance. 2, they did it before the landings. And 3, they were successful. And none of those things are true. And the Operation Neptune orders and reports, and then the individual orders for the individual sailing groups, Force S for Sword, Force J for Juno, Force G for Gold, and then their subsequent reports. These are voluminous documents. There is not one thing in them about any form of pre-invasion landing to clear these obstacles before the assault units come in. And instead, everything in them contradicts that sort of claim. And so here, for instance, this is the orders for Force S, and very much as in the report that I just showed you, there it is: landing craft obstacle clearance units in landing group 5, landing at 20 minutes past H hour. The reason I sort of have to ram this home is because the myth has become so entrenched that you really have to counter it quite strongly to get people to believe you. There is literally not one shred of evidence in any primary source document to support the idea that there were preliminary landings and the obstacles were cleared in advance of the initial H hour. And the timings of these landings, there's a veteran alive today who claims that he was leading divers in at midnight, so 7 hours in advance.
But isn't this just people mixing in with X-type submarines and parties of a year earlier and mixing it all up and creating a new story out of elements that are all partly true, but they don't work together?
Yeah, that's the problem, and it's understandable. This is the thing. I mean, aside from the guy I just mentioned, who I cannot see that could have been an accidental memory. Most of the people have accidental memories, I think, or they're mixing their memories up. They're quite elderly, and memory is a very fragile thing. I do not hold any grudge against them. Yeah. The problem is that people take this information completely on board. They accept it far too willingly, and that's it. And I had a conversation with somebody once who said, "Oh, well, we can never know the full story." Like, yes, we can. The reports are all there. There is nothing stupid about D-Day.
When at the beginning, and you talked about the fact I'm giving you a platform, and what I'm doing on World War II TV is, we all know that if you put something on YouTube about first men in, uncovered story, secret this, it gets more attention than just saying they came in at the same time as everything else. These words like before, ahead of, we go and we look, and so it's the people who want to clickbait kind of stuff, whether it's by YouTube, podcast, online articles, documentaries, books, whatever, it draws your attention in. If you can say the men who went in first, it sounds better than the men who went in along with lots of other people at the same time. So we can. It doesn't forgive why these things happen, but it does help to explain them, I think.
Yeah, I think it proves that we just need to be, as the people who are receiving this information, we just need to be more critical and slightly less immediately accepting. And we need to say, well, that's very interesting, but we need to corroborate these things. And that is unfortunately what hasn't happened, and that's what's led to this situation. The information within the orders and the reports is all very, very clear. So this is the orders for the LCOCUs for what is this? This is Gold Beach. The 4 landing craft obstacle clearance units will follow immediately astern of the LCT, and it's there in black and white. Ramsey's report again. It was also evident that the solution to the underwater obstacles lay in adjusting the times of H-hour for individual assault forces so that the first waves would touch down short of the obstacles to allow dry shod clearance of them to be carried out. So that's Ramsey. That's the highest level of report available. And then his subsequent report, the tide was higher when the landing craft obstacle clearance units arrived. The beaches of Outer Roads were nearly covered. He is clearly stating the arrival times for the obstacle clearance units there. And in answer to one of your earlier questions, Paul, so little obstacle clearance was achieved at this time because of the surf and everything we discussed. But then point 52, most of the clearance done at this time was by major landing craft which beached at full speed. So, one of the reasons it worked is, like I said, the landing craft obstacle clearance units and the Royal Engineers, they adjusted to the situation, and so did the landing craft crews. They took it upon themselves to bust through them as the orders had specified, and it worked.
And that they went for the blunter approach rather than the more precise trained for approach. But as you said,
there was clearance of obstacles, but it was just not the envisaged or ideal method. So yeah, I feel bad hammering on about it because I'm saying that these people are wrong, and people don't like hearing that, but it does need to be said because it is one of the more prevalent myths about D-Day. And I think that's a shame because this is a shot of HMS Savannah being sunk by a torpedo by Hoffman's 5th Torpedo Boat Flotilla off Sword Beach, and this is 5:30 in the morning on D-Day. This is 2 hours before H-hour on Sword Beach. It's a full hour before the 1st Infantry touched the ground on the Utah and Omaha beaches. This is well in advance of H-hour, and this is D-Day. This is part of D-Day. The battle did not start when the men first touched down on the beaches. We shouldn't see H-hour as the defining moment of D-Day. And of course, before all of this, there's everything that had happened overnight. There's the landings at Pegasus Bridge. There's San Mary-Glease. There's all of the airborne operations touching down. That's also D-Day. And D-Day was a combined operation. And one of the things that does grate a little bit about this whole thing is this obsession with when men finally touch the beach, when you've got all of this other stuff happening before that is part and parcel of a combined operation. And D-Day was the greatest achievement in terms of amphibious and combined operations. And that is the thing that we should recognize and study more, I think, rather than this obsession with who was first ashore, because nobody was first ashore. So many units were touching down at almost exactly the same time that there's no one identifiable unit you can say, oh, well, they were the first. It doesn't matter. Why does that matter?
Well, we're in danger of ending up talking about the Versailles Memorial again, which Ben Main is watching, and that idea of how you catalogue and record this event. When does it start? When does it end? Because, we've done numerous shows on World War II TV about, and as you've mentioned it, the aerial reconnaissance, Matt Bone and the Typhoons knocking out radar installations, the SOE, all those other 1,000,001 things that had to be to precede the actual invasion, the Operation Aquatint, all the commando raids. You add them, and then it carried on way beyond this. The people who are still assimilating information that's being used in events months later. We should move away from this idea that D-Day starts on D-Day, but it is so easy to hang on this idea that it starts on June the 6th, because when does it start? If it doesn't start then, what is the day of it starting? And the point is, there isn't an actual day it starts. When people say, when did they, I always say, when people say to me, when did they start planning the invasion of France? I say, well, effectively, I'm sure there were conversations happening on the boats back from Dunkirk. They're already beginning to think, how the hell are we going to get back? Now, that's not official planning, but that's people talking about how we're going to do this the next time. So effectively, that's when it started.
Yeah. And, I've said before, if you wanted to try and put a specific time on the start of Neptune, you can go for the evening of the 26th of May when Ramsay announces it, and then they seal the camps, and that's the best time you can say that Neptune started, because there's all of this other stuff which I'm interested in, which is the embarkation and all of the logistics that are necessary for an operation to succeed. But then, yes, in advance of that, you've got the recon missions, you've got the airstrikes, and all of that stuff. So, yeah, it's very difficult to pin down a time. If I was to pin down the amphibious assault bit, I would say the 26th of May. But, that's picking one bit of it, the bulk bit. But there's all of these other elements, as you say.
Yeah, the intelligence that has created the system in place to start the amphibious stuff the work has already been undertaken before then. So it's trying to determine something that isn't worth determining. Basically, we need to accept the fact this is a progressive event, and it's that's it. So
and so in conclusion, really, I think the work of the landing craft obstacle clearance units, alongside the work of the Royal Engineer units that were doing exactly the same task above the waterline, and who eventually landing craft obstacle clearance units worked alongside because they never dived, is to be highly regarded and congratulated. And they did an immense feat demolishing these obstacles, which Ramsay himself said were their greatest enemy. It didn't happen as had been planned, and it didn't happen as the legend suggests, but it did happen, and they were very successful in that regard, in that D-Day worked, D-Day succeeded, and that's what people need to take home, I think. Rather,
you're seeing the same thing when Jonathan Ware did the show about the British and the Ardennes, is that he wanted to say, look, I want to tell the story of the British and the Ardennes, but let's not make it more of a story than it actually is. The Ardennes is still always going to be a predominantly a US Army event. That's where the majority of the men were, but the British involvement is important to recognize, but let's not blow it out bigger than it was. And the same thing you're saying here is the role of these engineers, the role of the teams was important, but let's look at it for what they actually did and what they were trying to do, and not make more out of the story. Just analyze it as a factual thing, and it's still exciting. It's still cool, as you say. Still part of the success, but there's no need to inflate it.
This is one of the things I say about D-Day quite frequently, and not just D-Day, but so many of the Second World War stories and elements. You don't need to make stuff up. there's more than enough fascinating stories and fascinating tales, and tales of heroism and sacrifice, that you don't need to embellish it anymore. And you just need to look into the stories that are there, and they are absolutely fascinating themselves. And I hope that's what people will take home from this, even though I'm saying, sorry, the story that you've all heard is not true. I think the story itself, the actual events, are equally as fascinating.
And the story of how the erroneous stories happen. I mean, that article you showed from July 1944 in the War Illustrated, because as soon as you said that, I was thinking about, not that it's a connected subject, but it's similar is the whole Dirty Dozen idea. People say the Dirty Dozen film was based on a real event, and that was a report written by someone that came out in July or August 44 based on something he'd heard in a pub, basically, about criminals going in. But I guess it was that time when people who were wanting to write about stuff didn't have access to enough real stuff, so they kind of went with anything they kind of heard in a pub, because they wanted to get stories out there. And you could do a whole study of what kind of reports were coming out, because the public are now, in that summer of 44, they're thirsty for information about new units and incredible stuff that was helping for the victory. So if you're a journalist and you've got a little bit of a story and you can kind of hint it out there, and you can't have access to the real archives, it can explain how these little myths kind of get rooted. And then years later, there's something there that builds on it. So we could go round and round. Have you any more slides to go? Or we?
That's it. That's the last one.
Well, brilliant. I mean, this has been absolutely stonkingly good, and I knew it would be good. And viewer figures have been great, and people have been enjoying it. So it's a lesson to us all that they're. Just because I get it all the time in emails. Why are you doing more shows on D-Day? Why are you doing more shows on Market Garden? You go, because there's still more things to say. There's things that don't need saying. There's things that we don't need to bother discussing, but there's things that we can still go to a level of depth that is worth hearing about. So there we are. So what are you working on? Anything you want to plug or promote at the moment? I mean, obviously, I suggest if you're not following Stephen on Twitter, follow him on Twitter. Be prepared to have some of your illusions about the war blown apart. But you'll get angry first. I thought I knew that, and then you'll realize you've learned something new. But anything else you're working on at the moment?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned
talk
that
about
D-Day is, something that people are always interested in. And I don't know, somebody tweeted it yesterday, I think. It was a sort of meme thing, a fat book next to a really thin book. And the fat book said D-Day and the thin book said Bagration.
Yeah, I saw that one, yeah.
Yeah, and that's probably true. I don't know how much literature there is on Bagration. I have no idea. But I looked at the big fat book about D-Day and I thought, is it though? And I think if I was to describe the book of D-Day, it would probably be that thick, but it'd be more like a Swiss cheese. It would be full of holes and big gaps.
Nice analogy, yeah.
And I think there are some very, very big gaps on D-Day that people might not realise. And I got some very exciting news today. So you can expect to hear some very exciting news soon, but I can't tell you what it is just yet.
Cool, but I mean, we'll listen for it. But I mean, I'm going to kind of adapt your Swiss cheese analogy to kind of like some of the foundations we have taken as being fundamental to understanding are maybe not as solid as we thought they were. And if you look at them a bit, you'll find some of these things are flawed in how we assess things and how we've as this presentation today has been. And again, it happens all the time. The bombing missed on D-Day. There's something that is a lot more nuanced than that. Did the naval gunfire work? People just say no, it didn't. I get that, and you go, well,
that depends.
That's a very sweeping statement there, isn't it? So,
so a piece of mouldy Swiss cheese then.
Moldy Swiss cheese that's sitting on a table that's a bit rickety. Let's carry on. We'll eventually get an analogy that works. But anyway, this has been brilliant stuff. So I'll just remind people what we've got coming up, and then I'll come back and say goodbye in a second. So, folks, actually, probably 2 nights where nothing's happening, unless I squeeze something in Thursday, but I don't know. I was hoping to schedule the show that had to be postponed about the Wannsee conference, but Mark Roseman, my guest, is overseas and his internet connection is not good enough to do it. So I was hoping that would be tomorrow, but it's not going to happen because he's got steam-powered, hamster-powered driven internet. So I'll have to wait for him to get back to the USA, but I will reschedule that Wannsee show. But other than that, our next show is Friday, when we're back to Operation Veritable, and Dermot Rooney is talking about the attack by the 51st Iron Division and others onto the German town of Gok. So unless I end up scheduling something before then, that'll be the next show. And then lots of stuff next week with Special Forces Week. We've got Jenny Grant is back there talking about Polish commandos. We've got First Special Service Force, all sorts of things coming up. But right now, it looks like it's 2 days of nothing. But anyway, I'm going to say thank you, Stephen, for doing this, and superlative performance, and I can't wait to bring you back. I was just saying before we went live, I think Stephen now holds the record in gap between first and last appearance, because he was on the Marathon June the 6th show a year and a half ago and hasn't been on since. So that's the record of the longest gap between appearances. So we'll have to make sure the next time is close, is sooner. So if you're happy to come back, Stephen, we'll have you back.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. Yeah, I thoroughly enjoy giving these webinars, as I said earlier. And I mean, yours are very informative and very enjoyable. I don't watch all of them, I confess, because there's one every night.
I don't watch all of them. No, I do watch all.
There's plenty more topics to discuss on all manner of subjects, not just me, obviously, but I could bore you to tears on other subjects.
Yeah, we'll have you back. Brilliant. So there we are then, folks. This is Paul Woodadge and Stephen Fischer for World War II TV. Unless you hear something else, I will see you Friday for the Operation Veritable show. So thanks for your attention this evening. Cheers, everybody. Bye.